Makers and Mystics is a podcast for creative-minded chasers of beauty, wonder, and truth. Each week, I host conversations with various artists, theologians, culture shapers, and leading voices from diverse backgrounds on topics related to the creative process and how our spiritual lives intersect with creativity. If you're new here, thanks for listening in. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Makers and Mystics and leave us a review on iTunes. At the end of today's program, I'll share a link to download my free ebook, 5 Creativity Killers and How to Avoid Them. I'm your host, Stephen Roach. This is Season 5, Episode 11. Sleeping at Last is the moniker of Chicago-based singer-songwriter, producer, and composer Ryan O'Neal. Ryan's music has been featured on popular television shows like Grey's Anatomy, Criminal Minds, and The Vampire Diaries, and has appeared in films such as The Fault in Our Stars and The Twilight Saga. Ryan has collaborated with numerous noteworthy songwriters such as Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins, Jon Foreman of Switchfoot, Sarah Brightman, and many others. Recently, Ryan has turned his creative attention to writing songs from the Enneagram. I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with the Enneagram, but for anyone who is not, the Enneagram is essentially a personality typing system combining spiritual wisdom and modern psychology to describe 9 distinct, dynamic ways of being in the world. This description of the Enneagram was given to us by today's sponsor, Sarah Douay. I'll be introducing you to more of Sarah's work with the Enneagram later in this episode. When I spoke with Ryan about his music composition, his Enneagram songs, and what motivates his creativity, he had completed 8 of the 9 songs complementing each Enneagram type. Ryan's 9th and final installment of this collection is due to release on June 9th, 2019. I hope you enjoy this conversation with singer-songwriter Ryan O'Neal of Sleeping at Last. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me on Makers and Mystics. I'm thrilled to have you on the show.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for setting up this conversation.
I've been listening to your music for a while, and your Atlas series is one of my favorite albums to listen to when I have a long plane ride.
Oh, that's cool. That's awesome to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of those records you can play from start to finish, and it feels like it accompanies you on your journey.
Oh, that's awesome. I always love the idea of the music getting to go places that I don't go.
Yeah.
It's vicariously traveling.
That's right. Well, I'm really interested in your creative process in your writing, and I know you're a multi-instrumentalist. You've done a lot of composition for film and television, and so your music carries this cinematic quality to it. And why don't we start with just telling us some of your inspiration and what kind of motivates you in the music that you write?
Yeah, for sure. So I've always gravitated towards just really deeply personal music. So I think I've tried for the past since I guess I was 13 or 14 years old, starting to write songs, to make it as like my audio journal of sorts. Like I really do process everything I'm feeling and experiencing through songs. And so, and I think that's because of the music that I grew up listening to. I always gravitated towards the emotional like ballads of every record. And even as a kid, like the first time I had, the hair on my arm stand up, I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I want to do something that could, something that's invisible that could move people in that way. It just seems so beautiful and fascinating. So I've just been chasing that ever since.
Mm-hmm. Well, your music has this magical quality to it, and I just get the sense that it invites the listener to regain this childlike perspective, and
wow,
at least that's been true for me. And it's allowed me to see and to hear beauty in life through that lens of wonder, and I think that's something that you do well in capturing that.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's a huge compliment. Honored.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you've done recently, which I know so many people are talking about, and you've probably saved so many marriages through your Enneagram songs. I know my wife, she told me, she's like, when I listened to number 7, it brought her to tears. But I'd love to ask you, Tell me some about that series, about
Yeah.
what sparked that journey with the Enneagram songs.
Yeah, for sure. So I first always kind of land up in the weeds here, so you'll excuse me. But the Atlas series, it basically tells this story throughout the course of I think it'll end up being about 70 or so songs total.
Wow.
And the first chapter of Atlas was Atlas 1, and it is all about the origins of all things. So it's about first darkness, the unknown, then it's light, and then it's songs based on each of the planets in our solar system, and then it gets closer and closer to Earth, and I sing, or I have songs based on the oceans, and that leads to life. And so Atlas 2 is all about involuntary human development, which is I did songs based on the senses, the four basic human emotions, and that leads us to the Enneagram. So there's two different trains of thought about the Enneagram. One is that it is more of a you become your type as you get older, and then the other thought is that it's wired into you. And I always personally loved that idea that the wiring is already there, and you just are becoming yourself as you get older. So it felt perfect to try to write songs from that perspective in this part of Atlas that is about involuntary human development. So that's how it fits into my Atlas series. But I was introduced to the Enneagram about 6 or 7 years ago through my friend Chris Hewerts, and who's an Enneagram genius and has been studying, and is an incredible teacher and author. He wrote a book called The Sacred Enneagram since teaching me about the Enneagram, that's available now. And I was hugely skeptical. I don't know what your perspective was on the Enneagram when you first heard about it, but I was like, oh, good, another way for people to feel like they don't have to change, and every bad thing they do is just because of their type or their whatever. So I was, when he was introducing it to us, I was very skeptical, but I love him, so I heard him out, and he went through each of the types, and we kind of, talked about, I think most people's introduction to the Enneagram is like, oh, wow, okay, I think I know a 7, or I think I know somebody, my dad's exactly like this, and so honestly, from that conversation forward, the Enneagram has kind of like haunted my world. Like it comes up in every, I see it's like invisible in every relationship. It's like this through line that just makes so much sense of different, past relationships, and it makes sense of things that went wrong and things that went right, and who I am and why I do what I do. And it's been a huge, as you said, it's a huge, like, helpful way of understanding my wife, and for her as well, for understanding me. So yeah, I kind of fell in love with it, and then it fit beautifully into this Atlas thing that I'm doing. So that was a very long answer. I apologize.
Yeah, that's good. And truthfully, yeah, I came into it much the same way.
Yeah.
And being an Enneagram 4 with a 5 wing,
like, don't put me in a box.
That's exactly right. I was like, don't call me a 4. I'm not a number.
Exactly.
Well, that's fascinating. I guess the question then is, what Enneagram are you yourself?
I am a type 9, so I am I guess that some people call it the peacemaker or the dreamer, it's funny, of all the 9 types, I've been researching pretty hard to try to write from the perspective of every type, and I'm currently in the process of finishing up writing the type 9 song, which is the end of the Enneagram songs. And of course I have to return to myself and try to figure myself out, and I'm kind of embarrassed at the end of 2 years of pretty hard research. I know the least about the type 9.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, yeah, I'm learning from scratch here.
Each of the songs, and you kind of hinted at this, but sonically, you've really well captured the different temperaments of each Enneagram. And
thanks.
I'm curious to know a little about the process that went into that. Did you study each Enneagram and then conceptually interpret that through sound? How did you go about making these?
Yeah, for sure. So I knew that I was going to write these Enneagram songs probably 3 or 4 years ago. And so since then, I have, I went to this kind of interesting retreat with a handful of people, and to learn about the Enneagram through Father Richard Rohr. And I obviously had a million conversations with my friend Chris, who introduced me to the Enneagram, and have learned most of what I know about the Enneagram through Chris. And so that was the beginning of my research. And I was just kind of keeping notes and kind of writing down some just really basic ideas, like, okay, well, the most obvious, thing to do musically for the type 8, that's more of the intense and powerful type, like, would be to do this really powerful and intense song. And then the more you learn about the type, or at least for me, the more I learned about like what really motivates the type 8, I adjusted kind of that original idea, like, okay, no, it needs to be more like this, because each of these songs need to be stories of redemption. They don't need to be definitions of the type. People already they have that already. That's what I don't like about any personality framework. And so it was really important for me to be able to, as I was writing each of the songs, to dive in as deep as I could in reading everything I could about that particular type. But then also, I think just having lots of conversations with friends that identify as that type, and trying to look for just some commonality between the things I was learning. And then there was a point with each of these 9 songs that I could feel, like in the research, I could feel like all of a sudden this deep empathy towards the type, like it just kind of clicked. And I felt like that was the moment that I was able to stop the research and write what I'm experiencing or thinking through from that perspective.
Show me how to lay my soul down for long enough to let you through. Here I am, prod me open. What do you want?
The Enneagram is deeply enmeshed with a spiritual framework, and I know that most of the listeners of this podcast on Makers and Mystics are really interested in the relationship between creativity and spirituality. And so I'm curious how this Atlas journey and your journey through the Enneagram, how has this personally affected your own spiritual journey or your understanding of the origins of the universe that you talked about with some of your other music?
Yeah, so one of the things that that feels kind of like church for me in a way is David Attenborough's different BBC documentaries about nature, and Life in the Undergrowth and Planet Earth and all these different types of documentaries. I just fell deeply in love with like the beauty and the wonder and the complex nature of all things. And so for writing music that's based on themes, and especially these really broad themes like, songs for the planets and things like that, I think it taps me into, I get to spend all of my time exploring these different parts of the universe. And that just feels, to me, it makes me feel more connected and more, just gives me a deeper sense of gratitude for the insane reality that we are here and get to even have this conversation right now. Like I feel like it keeps my eyes a little bit more open as I'm focusing and researching and trying to write and create based on the wonder that I'm experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a technical musical question for you, but
yeah.
What instrument or instruments do you typically gravitate toward first when you're composing?
Especially the last several years, piano. I'm like, guitar is probably my main instrument, my first instrument. But I love the piano, and I feel like because I don't really like, I was never taught how to play any of the things that I play. Mm-hmm. So I feel like most of the time I'm just fumbling through and discover things that way. But for the piano, I just find that I'm even though I might be playing a C chord, I don't look at it that way. It just sounds new if I play it with if 2 fingers are this way, and so I constantly am tricking myself into being like, wow, what's that? Nobody's ever heard this chord in the history of time. It's just a G or whatever. But I find myself always gravitating towards the piano these days.
We'll return to our conversation right after this brief introduction to today's sponsor. In the episode opening, I read a description of the Enneagram given to us by Sarah Douay. Sarah is an artist, communicator, and Enneagram teacher. She works with groups and individuals to help foster creativity, connection, and community. To learn more about her new workshop, Enneagram Creativity, The 9 Types of Making, visit sarahdouay.com. That's Sarah with an H and DUET.com. We'll have a link to Sarah's work in the show notes of this episode and in the sponsor listings on makersandmystics.com.
But I wanna be here, truly be here.
Did you find that certain instruments lent themselves to interpreting some of these concepts? Like when you're composing these different Enneagram songs, did you find that certain instruments and the temperament of the instrument coincided more with a particular Enneagram number?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So for example, like my type 8 song, I knew that the first half needed to be all staccato instruments.
I remember the minute it was like a switch was flipped.
So that could be pizzicato strings. It could be anything that has an abrupt nature to it. So that was kind of the basically with all of these songs I write. I write out these almost like this list of rules creatively to just be like, these are different rules that I had to restrictions that I have to adhere to for writing this song, and it's really, really helpful. So I knew that, for example, like the strings always represent the heart in these Enneagram songs specifically. So anytime you hear strings, it's trying to bring in the heart triad of the Enneagram into the thinking of the story or the song. And then anytime you hear piano, I feel like piano is more of the, it's kind of the through line. It's almost like the personality itself. So I guess it's connected to the 9. So I want almost all of these Enneagram songs to kind of have the base of a piano at the beginning. And then rhythm and tempo is sort of how I'm processing the body. So this internal like heartbeat, So I have all these different little creative restrictions and rules that I love applying to each of these songs, because I think that it just helps so much in being able to explore in a different way, because nothing is more scarier than a blank canvas.
What you're saying reminds me, a few seasons back on the podcast, we interviewed a visual artist. Her name's Linnea Spranzi. And Linnea is an incredible visual artist, but she talked a lot about the relationship between order and chaos. And in her work, she always sets out a very strict set of limits and a very strict set of rules that she works in, but inside that framework, she finds an immense amount of freedom.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly how I feel too. That's actually a huge part of why I write music based on a theme. So when I have, like, for example, for the Atlas stuff, I've laid out this framework and these themes that I'm going to write songs based on, and that just having that piece is so helpful. For example, if I'm writing, songs for the 4 basic human emotions, if I'm writing the song called Joy, I'm not going to be having like the world's saddest piano chords, and that framework has been so helpful. I feel like it kind of ties into my love of film scores and just cinematic music, because obviously film scoring is watching something and trying to create an emotional resonance through music. And so I feel like I'm trying to do that a little bit just in my own songwriting for these themes. I'm treating them like they're these invisible film scores.
Mm-hmm. Well, you bring up something that I wanted to ask you about as well, and that is your relationship to film and your relationship to the visual as it pertains to your composition.
Yeah.
Because I know you've done a lot for Grey's Anatomy and different film and television spots. When you're writing for something like that, do you write to the visual, or do you, like for instance, I interviewed Chad Lawson, who's a piano player and composer, and Chad was saying he just asked the director to give him one word, and then
I love that.
Yeah, and then he takes that one word and he interprets it through his process on the piano. And so I'm curious, what is your relationship to the visual?
Yeah, that's so cool. I've had the privilege of working on a bunch of different film and TV things that require different things. Sometimes they're using the kind of cinematic music I'm already making, and other times I will be scoring to picture, which I've done a bunch, and then other times I will be writing, with a very, very specific set of guidelines kind of given to me by the director or by the show producers or whatever it is. And I love all of it. Like I feel like I really, really enjoy the process of like what you just said, somebody giving you a word and trying to figure out what that sounds like musically. That's some of the most fun and I think interesting ways to go about making music. I just think that deeply I think it probably actually connects to me growing up and just loving movies and TV shows. So when I get a chance to try to figure out if I have some sort of creative jumping off point, like a word or something like that, even when I'm not working on film and TV, I get to always kind of be in that framework. It's really inspiring and really creatively fulfilling to do that.
Yeah.
I think with feedback on if you're seeing something visual, knowing just setting your hands on the piano keyboard, there's an instant feedback of that works or it doesn't work, and I love that about it. It's very clear. It's very it's almost like a process of it doesn't work well before it works, and that's always really helpful.
Yeah. Now, have you always done music, or did you pursue other lines of work or other art forms before you got into composition?
Not really. Yeah. So I fell in love with music when I got my first guitar, which was around 13 or 14 years old. And then pretty quickly after that, started writing my own stuff and just was madly in love with the craft of writing songs. And I had some really amazing support around me. Like my mom's a huge supporter of any direction that I would have chosen to do with my life. So early on, I wanted to be a Disney animator. Then after that, I wanted to be a basketball player. And but when I found music, I was 100% certain that this is what I wanted to do. And so I've had not only that family support, but I had a musician in town that I really looked up to take me under his wing and teach me about the craft of songwriting and lyric construction and things like that. So I feel like I got a very informal music education that has served me I think will serve me until I stop making music due to death.
That's right.
That got dark really quick.
It starts with our eyes well acquainted with the dark. The mind was made to illuminate the heart.
Well, you mentioned your lyrics, and just from one writer to the next, I do want to say that your lyrics are some of my favorite. And
oh wow, thank you.
Yeah, and they really do embody that cinematic. They're very visual, and I love.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I feel like that I'm like a visual learner, so I feel like that was like the only way I knew how to write anything was like to talk about analogy or to talk about visual. Yeah, to try to fit images into words.
Who would you say are some of your biggest inspirations as far as poets or writers?
Poets or writers. So I'm embarrassed to admit that I have only recently started reading poetry.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I love. Is it David White?
Mm-hmm. I love David White.
I love David White's work. Mary Oliver. So I'm brand new to being like, wow, you can do some really beautiful things with words. Mm-hmm. I would say that I've been most inspired by either other musicians or movies and TV.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, for someone that hasn't read poetry for a very long time, your lyrics embody a natural poetry about them that's beautiful.
Oh, that's cool. Thank you so much.
When you're writing, do you mainly draw influence from your own personal experience and from reflections on memories, or what really draws the most creatively out of you?
Yeah, I would say that putting everything through the lens of my own experience has been a helpful thing. I think it's free therapy,
yeah,
in one way, but it is part of that audio journal that I mentioned, where it's like even when I'm writing based on themes, or even writing from the perspective of these different, the 8 other different Enneagram perspectives, I think what I'm doing even that process is realizing the commonality between myself and other people, or so even when I'm telling a story of somebody else, it's very much of myself is ingrained in that. So that might make me just a narcissist. Now that I say it out loud.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, most of your work is concept writing from the way that I would see it. For sure. I remember several years ago, Sufjan Stevens said, I'm going to do a song for every state in the union, and I think he made it through 3 of them, but you've already made it through 8 Enneagram.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, you're ahead of the game. But so that leads me to the question then, what can we expect for an Atlas 3?
Yeah, so Atlas 3 will be voluntary human development. So Atlas 2 is involuntary, so Atlas 3 is voluntary. So it's what we do with everything that we're given. So it's what we do with our senses. It's what we do with all of the things that make us human. And so it's love, it's dream, it's faith, it's every aspect of being a human being.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for taking this time to talk with us on Makers and Mystics.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Makers and Mystics podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Ryan O'Neill. Be sure to visit makersandmystics.com for over 5 seasons of interviews with artists and influencers who will inspire you along your creative journey. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned that I would give you a link to download my free ebook, 5 Creativity Killers and How to Avoid Them. Visit creativitykillers.net or follow the link in the show notes to get your free copy today. If you'd like to support the production of these podcasts, join our creative collective at patreon.com/makersandmystics. This episode was self-produced by me, Stephen Roach, with content curation by Anne-Marie Mueller and music by Sleeping at Last. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again next week.